Thank you so much for having me here. I will say that I am speaking on behalf of a very large scientific team. We are the Behavior Change for Good Network, and we are a team of social scientists. And I will give you a very partial snapshot of what we look like. This is a small subset of the over 180 behavioral scientists, some of them psychologists, some of them economists, some of them sociologists, some of them neuroscientists. We have physicians. There are, I think, at least a couple of legal scholars, but all of us study behavior change, and we were asking each other, how can we make progress on this perennial human question? How can people change their behavior for the better, whether that's exercising more, sleeping more, snacking less, saving more money for retirement, studying for college, that sort of choice that, so many of us, have struggled with or maybe do struggle with. And, one of the, questions that, came up as we began, and I say we in particular, Katie Milkman and I are the co-directors and founders of this initiative. And I will tell you, I am Katie's vice president. So, credit and deference, go to Katie. When Katie and I were asking ourselves this question, the other scientists that were at the beginning of this project, we said, it's really hard to predict, right? It's really hard to predict what's going to work. Every scientist at the beginning of a study thinks their treatment is going to be their control, as if we had a crystal ball that we could look into. And that always seems like a good idea. And then, we run some kind of study. Maybe there's one treatment, one control. That's very typical. And, we say, hey, we're going to publish this finding. Sometimes we're right. Often we're right. Very often we're wrong. And then somebody else comes along and they say, wow, Angela Duckworth, Katie Milkman, or whoever it was, they found that this hypothesis was confirmed. Now that should work in this new setting. And very often it doesn't. And then they will publish a different study. And now you have another study. And these conflicting findings that come from traditional field studies are very hard to harmonize or make collective sense of, because they will, of course, have different samples. Maybe I did fifth graders, you did ninth graders. Maybe my outcome variable was report card grades and yours was standardized test scores or attendance. I mean, in every social science study, there is a choice of sample and outcomes and design, and you cannot make apples to apples comparisons across studies. Traditional field studies, we call them, meaning they're not in the lab, but they're out in the field with a real behavioral outcome. They tend to be expensive too. So how many of these studies can you actually run? I mean, every principal investigator who has to get their own money to do a field study will tell you that it is expensive. There's risk, there's logistical complexity, and very often the results are null, and that creates a file drawer problem because, of course, it is not always in seemingly the journal's interest to publish null results, hypotheses that are not confirmed. Another pattern that Katie and I noticed is that, the psychologists publish for psychologists, the economists publish for economists, the neuroscientists publish for neuroscientists. There's not a lot of truly interdisciplinary work where teams across social sciences are competing with interdisciplinary teams, and certainly not, even connecting or communicating with other disciplines. And finally, last bullet point on this slide is that most traditional field studies tend to be underpowered because it's very expensive to recruit a very large sample of participants. And we had the following idea: a megastudy. What is a megastudy? A megastudy is a very large field experiment that simultaneously compares different intervention approaches designed by different scientists, very often from different disciplines. They're all aimed at improving the same policy relevant outcome. So a mega study is an apples to apples study of many treatments, all competing against each other, sometimes against their own control group, sometimes against a single mega study control by which every treatment is compared. And if you think about a traditional field experiment as being for example, 2 conditions, you could think of a mega study as being then many conditions. And that is what Behavior Change for Good has done, in addition to other initiatives, but I think it's been our most important contribution. Big is beautiful, we think, because in addition to that apples to apples comparison that you really want for policy reasons and even just to advance theory, you do achieve economies of scale. So yes, experiments are expensive, but when you pool resources and you tackle something like, let's get millions of people who are trying to achieve a certain behavioral outcome. I mean, whether it's saving for retirement or we've done a study with millions of school children who are, trying to do better in school, in elementary school. We can achieve these economies of scale. We can pool risk so that, learning nothing useful is unlikely. We can centralize the project management. So we have a team that works on behalf of many scientists at many universities. We can also guarantee that the file drawer problem will not be our problem because we pre-register in advance the mega study and we promise to present the results however they turn out. This is an inherently interdisciplinary collaboration. And because we were able to achieve these very large sample sizes with these pooled resources, we actually now finally have the statistical power to do things like test for moderation. Now, this is kind of abstract, so let me walk you through 5 of our mega studies. I will go in order, and the first is also the earliest of these mega studies, and that was to look at the outcome of physical exercise with a partner 24-hour fitness, which is one of the largest gym chains in the United States. We published this work in a paper called Megastudies Improve the Impact of Applied Behavioral Science, where we also introduced this new paradigm for doing research. And I'll walk you through what our participants were and our procedure. This was over 60,000 members of the 24-hour fitness gyms across 46 states. These were adults, largely, well, not largely, but 65% female. In this particular mega study, there was a placebo control group that I'll say a little bit more in a moment. There was also a baseline intervention, meaning there was a kind of best practice intervention that we decided would be the thing to beat, right? The horse to beat in the race. And that was having planning as a, when are you going to go to the gym, reminders of, going to the gym at the time that you planned, and then micro incentives, meaning not incentives that, are going to make a big difference in your life. I think it ended up being like something like 20 cents for every gym visit, but something that would make going to the gym more immediately rewarding. So, in addition to kind of like an empty a control group, there was this kind of best practice. You can call it a placebo control if you want. In this first mega study, there were 30 scientists who designed 20 different pre-registered research studies comprising 53 experimental treatments, right? Some had, 2 conditions listed, some had 3. And then, of course, there were these baselines and comparisons for the entire mega study. There was a 28-day treatment period for these gym members, and the modality for us to be interacting with them was text messages and emails. So if you were a scientific team member, you would be able to design your own text messages and emails and try to beat, another team's messaging. There were all kinds of ideas, and these are, anything from trending social norms, like, did you know that, more and more Americans are going to gyms, to, goal setting and planning, if-then planning. There were teams who said, like, oh, I know how to, frame exercise as being fun. There was temptation bundling, an idea that Katie Milkman herself pioneered. And we, as the leaders of the study, it didn't matter if whether we, were betting on one horse and the other. We were primarily there to see, which horse won. We built an app for this mega study. This is the kind of thing that I think no given scientist at a given school is going to say like, oh, I have the resources to build my own app to do a massive field study with a national partner. But, the pooled resources that enabled us to do that, we called it Step Up. There was a landing page, a consent form. You signed in with your contact information, and then, across everyone but the holdout control, there was, this planning stage. There was this automatic reminder text feature. And then, as I said, there were points that translated into financial micro incentives at the very end of the 28-day period. The winner, to share with you, the horse that won. Well, there were a few actually that I want to highlight in this case, but one of them was sometimes called back on the wagon. And this is the idea that if you go to the gym and you miss a workout, your motivation to go to the next workout diminishes. And the idea here was that if you could give people a very, very small cash bonus, just to incentivize them to make it more fun to go back to the gym, like they would do that, and that turned out to be supported by the data. Another winner was just larger incentives. And you won't be surprised that, economists like this idea that, pay people more. And so, for example, making the incentive 10 times larger indeed improved gym visits. And then the third that I'll highlight here, because these three kind of rose above the rest, were trending social norms, which I mentioned earlier. And you won't be surprised that Bob Cialdini was a part of that team. The idea that, if you know that more and more Americans are going to the gym, that you yourself might want to go to the gym. By the way, the reason why we needed to use, or one of the reasons why trending social norms are relevant here, is that you can't say that the majority of Americans are going to the gym all the time, because they're not, but you can emphasize that the trend is positive. Overall, though, when we do these mega studies, we look at all of the data and all of the treatment conditions. And here I just have, for ease of illustration, the placebo control, which is really kind of this empty shell. That's the vertical blue line, and then you can kind of index how these individual treatments did against that. The dotted blue line, if you can see that to the right, you can see planning, reminders, and micro incentives. That best practices did pretty well. We did build that into the sort of the baseline for scientists to then try to beat that. And so these ideas like trending social norms were kind of, in addition to the planning, reminders, and micro incentives, like what's the marginal gain. So, not everything was dramatically effective. And, as a group, there was a benefit. I would say the key findings were that when you correct for multiple comparisons, more than a third of treatments boosted weekly gym visits significantly, by a range from 9% to 27%. That might not seem like a big effect size to you, but the marginal cost was quite small, 75 cents per person over the 4 weeks. One thing we also learned from this is that changing behavior for good is a lot harder than we thought. And in general, the benefits did not endure after the 28-day treatment period. And finally, I will say, and I remember Danny Kahneman was one of our scientists at the time, and kind of a mentor for Katie and me. We were talking about the findings and about how the pre-registered comparisons, were largely unsuccessful. In other words, scientists stared into their crystal ball and they said, my treatment's going to be great. And they were mostly wrong. And one person who was not surprised by that was Danny Kahneman. And he said that, we have this tendency to think about our hypothesis when we go to bed at night, and then we think about our hypothesis when we wake up in the morning. And as his other research has shown, what you see is all there is. It comes to pass that all you can think about is the one thing that you want to change. And you forget about all the other factors that influence whether somebody does or doesn't go to the gym. And so I think that was also a very important finding that, hopefully we'll talk about more in the Q&A. Giving this to you in roughly chronological order. So flu vaccination was something we worked on in part because around this time, COVID was happening, and there was not yet the development of a COVID vaccine, but there was the hope of that. And as behavioral scientists, we knew that any vaccine was going to have to be taken to be effective. And so we wanted to start working on the behavior change problem of vaccination, even in advance of COVID, the COVID vaccine being fully developed. So I want to share with you what we learned. Again, this was published as a mega study. We have very long author bylines because, we have many, many members of the team who were part of this tournament. There were over 47,000 adults who all had an upcoming primary care appointment in this study. In this case, our mega study control group was basically care as usual. There were 26 scientists who designed 19 different experimental treatments that varied, in this case, text messages that nudged vaccination patients, and were sent to patients in the 3 days leading up to their already scheduled primary care appointment. The winner that I will highlight here is flu shot is reserved for you. So the text is kind of small, so I'll try to read this to you, and you can see the scientists on our team, on our overall team who were part of this particular team. John, this is a message from Penn Medicine about your upcoming appointment. You have an appointment with Dr. Smith on October 1st at 11 a.m. And it's flu season. A flu vaccine is available for you. Protect yourself and your family's health. Look out for a vaccine reminder message before your appointment. And then later, John, this is a reminder that a flu vaccine has been reserved for your appointment with Dr. Smith. And that innocent wording was very deliberate. So this idea that there would be something of an endowment effect, like you already have it, don't lose it. And also this kind of social expectation, like it's reserved for you, it's waiting for you. So you have to actually follow through and get it. This ended up being our best performing intervention. And I want to highlight another treatment that Katie and I just loved. It was a text message that was sharing basically humor, have you heard the one about the flu? Don't tell me, I don't want to pass it around, right? Like Katie and I slapped our knees and hooted out loud and we're like, that one's going to be amazing. We predict that one's going to win. And in fact, we were wrong. And one of the take homes in general is that it's I don't want to say impossible, but it's very, very difficult to predict what's going to happen at the end of a tournament. And maybe we could say that more broadly about social science. And that is the reason why we are an empirical science and why we think mega studies and other empirical work are so important. The key findings of this second mega study are that reminders do nudge vaccine adoption. So we looked collectively as a whole about, whether these text message reminders worked. And yes, they did work compared to the treatment as usual or primary care as usual. So reminders are good, right? People forget. Also that 2 reminders that really were, very, very specifically focused on, this is waiting for you, it's reserved for you, like that boosted vaccination at doctor's visits by 11%. Those are standouts. And then, this kind of casual language, surprising, the humorous, like we thought that would all work. We also thought interactive text messages that, asked you to text something. We were wrong. Incongruent language, what people are not expecting to get from their physician's office, and in this case, in retrospect, ended up not being useful. Third study, relatedly, are flu vaccinations, not at a particular physician's network, but at the pharmacy. I will tell you that in this study, which again had many authors, we were able to expand the sample size now to over 680,000 customers with a partnership with Walmart pharmacies. This is a national study. These are all customers who had previously, as in the last flu season, received their flu shot. These were, adults. Obviously, in this case, the mega study control group was no text reminders. And then against that, the scientists were competing, and then, of course, against each other. So 30 scientists designed 22 different text reminders. Winner, again, and you'll recall the study I just told you previous to this one, the flu shot waiting for you study, Walmart RX. Hi, John, it's flu season, and you can get a flu shot at Walmart. To help you remember, you'll receive another text in a few days. Flu vaccines prevent getting or spreading the flu. And then reminder, a flu shot is waiting for you at Walmart. And you can see when you compare the treatment effects across the different interventions in this mega study that one did markedly better than others. Than, for example, just telling people that, in trending social norms, more Americans are getting flu shots than in the past. It's certainly better than, a social kind of, a pro-social motivation intervention, do others a favor by getting the flu shot. One of the things that I want to emphasize is that when I show you the study of, those study results of a single mega study in a particular treatment context, this is the pharmacy, this is flu shots, we feel like we have a policy relevant insight. It does not say like, oh, trending social norms are always or never better than pro-social motivation, for example. And that is I guess, summary insight across our research that it depends on context. And that is why we feel like these policy relevant mega studies have to be sort of located in a context and then described in that context so that people don't overgeneralize. In this case, in this context, reminders that emphasize that a flu vaccine is waiting for you did outperform others, consistent with our second mega study. And also want to say that nagging also works. So, if you send 2 reminders, it's better than sending 1. We don't want to overstate the effect size, but we do think these are cost effective. And if you think about scale, you can really send text messages at nearly 0 cost. And if you did effectively scale what we found here, you could, see a 4 to 8% increase in vaccination, which would it translate into, 6 to 12 million Americans who are not getting vaccinated, which we will betray our political leanings here and say we think would be a very, very good thing. Sometimes mega studies lead to smaller follow-up studies, sometimes replications, very often extensions to then look into the mechanism of what's really going on in a treatment condition that ends up winning a mega study tournament. And that happened in this case. There were replications and extensions that, unearthed and also confirmed findings. And, we really do feel like there is something about the kind of like, it's reserved for you, it's already there, it's what's expected. That is, a very powerful behavioral science principle that we can take away and again, test in, but certainly hypothesize might be effective in other contexts. This is also a good mega study to emphasize that dissemination is, I think, part of our responsibility as behavioral scientists. So to not hide our findings under the bushel of, a peer-reviewed publication that is in technical language that very few people are going to read. So, in this case, we do feel like this reserve for you language has made it out there, partly because it was, talked a lot about in the news. But when we get text messages, Katie and I, from our pharmacists, we're like, it's there. It's like, oh, Angela, your shot is waiting for you. And then I think, awesome, my shot is waiting for me. And also science works and can help people make better decisions. Fourth mega study that I want to share with you as an example, and again, hopefully hold, time for discussion, for conversation, for questions, and also for criticism. COVID boosters at the pharmacy, because thank goodness COVID vaccines were developed, and we were in particular looking at boosters because we knew that after the first time you got a shot, you might need to go back and get another. And of course, you have to go get there, right? So you have to, in many cases, travel if you don't happen to live, right next to your pharmacy. This was a partnership with Lyft, which agreed to provide free rides. At the time, if you can think back now a few years, one of the things that was talked about was the inequality of, who would be able to get to a pharmacy to get their COVID booster. And so Lyft very generously said that they would provide ride vouchers. And we, thought that sounded like a great idea. So did many of our team scientists. And, when I emphasized the importance of publishing null findings findings, in this case, the headline is that the free rides did not do anything. And we felt probably more excited about sharing this negative finding than we would have if it were a positive finding, because policy advances by knowing what works, and it also advances by knowing what doesn't work. And in this case, at least, giving vouchers for Lyft rides didn't do what we had expected. And we shared that with the partners who were part of that research. This partner was CVS, who very generously allowed us to engage with their team. This was a mega study that included well over 3 million patients nationwide. And this, again, just to emphasize that it's just hard to imagine a single professor saying like, hey, work with me. I have a team big enough to support a study of this scale and this complexity. Because when you do these kinds of studies, you become your own tech startup. You have a customer service branch and you have a marketing distribution branch, and it's a lot. The mega study control group, in this case, received no text messages. There was a baseline to beat, which at this point we upped the ante because we had done this prior research. So now the goal was to beat the idea of, your shopping waiting for you, reserved for you. And so that was the baseline intervention. Your booster is waiting for you at CVS, followed 7 days later by, remember, a COVID booster is waiting for you at CVS. We knew multiple reminders worked. And so now your task was harder as a social scientist. There were 9 scientists who designed an additional 7 different text messages. And that included one intervention that was the free ride to and from CVS has been reserved for your booster appointment. In this case, the winner was a planning prompt with what could be called a default plan. And this was led by Rob Kwan, who is one of Katie's star graduate students at Wharton. So, for example, it might say like, hi, John, hi, Katie, hi, patient first name. Updated COVID boosters are recommended to help prevent infection and severe illness. Your booster is waiting for you at, and it would give you your actual local pharmacy at CVS. Many find it helps to make a plan. Would Tuesday at 2 p.m. at 1 Main Street work? And we were able to look at the, previous vaccination, time and date and default people into what worked for them before. And of course, if that didn't work, there was the option to book a different time, but the default plan was a new idea. I will also say, and he was not part of this research study, but Luis Van On, who founded and runs Duolingo, which some of you use to learn a foreign language, he told me that, like, oh, of course, when you want to, remind somebody to do something, or, what you expect when you run an app is that people will be creatures of habit. And so, if Tuesday at 2 is generally a good time, then, all things being equal, Tuesday at 2 is a good time to ask if you want to do it again. That worked, but the Lyft rides, right, did not. Here are the data for a study. Again, we publish a figure like this in every mega study that we do. We show this apples to apples comparison. In this case, the key finding was that, contrary to expectations, free rides was not effective. We did find, again, that reminders work. We have consistently found this. And in this case, even the worst reminder generated really 80% of the effects. And reminders are very, very effective. There is separate research, of course, that we have not done on forgetting. And, human beings are so good at forgetting what we're trying to remember. By some estimates, as many of you know, over half of the things that a human being forgets are essentially their goals, their intentions. We estimate in this case that reminders produced an extra 33,864 COVID-19 boosters. In terms of flu vaccinations, which was run as a simultaneous study in fall 2022, over 10,000 flu vaccinations at nearly zero cost. Final mega study that I want to talk about is near and dear to my heart, because before I was a psychologist, I was a school teacher and I taught math. And so this was a partnership with a nonprofit math platform that enabled us to reach millions of kids across the country. So this was a partnership with Zern Math. This serves, I think now at this point, like up to 1 in 3 elementary schools in the United States, largely funded by the Gates Foundation, other philanthropies. Again, we publish our findings, whatever they turn out to be. In this case, I will say that we were so grateful as well to the teachers who use Zern Math. And these are teachers, 140,000 of them across about 25,000 schools. There are a few middle schools, but mostly this is elementary. It's an app, so we don't really know what the demographics were of the children who were the end receivers, but the key that I want to emphasize here is that the behaviorally informed messaging here was really targeting the teachers of those students. So there was a Megastudy control group. These are educators who received weekly reminders, primarily through email, but also if you went onto the Zern dashboard as a teacher and you logged in, you could see these reminders. Primarily, this is through email. These were weekly reminders in the Megastudy control group that there was a giveaway. So we created a raffle for this Megastudy. Again, not something that was easily done by any one scientist. We got folks like Carol Dweck and Neil deGrasse Tyson and, Judy Bloom to, kind of be part of the raffle in different ways, but, celebrity selfies and so forth. But the biggest thing was just that you could get gift cards and stickers and so forth. There were 19 scientists who designed 15 sets of weekly emails that tried to beat the raffle email, and that was embedded in 8 pre-registered sub-experiments. As I said, we're very grateful to the funders and to the celebrities who made it possible to have a attractive raffle for school teachers. And here's a visual snapshot of some of the pre-registered comparisons to sort of like sub-studies. You can imagine them that way within the overall tournament. Won't go into them in much detail, but I'm happy to talk about any of them in the Q&A. The winner was the weekly login. I have to say, this was a control condition in the eyes of the scientists who developed it. They were like, oh, well, we think maybe trying to get teachers to log in on Fridays is going to work. This was Colin Kammerer and some students. I was also part of this team. And Colin and his students had identified by looking at Zern Math data in previous years that teachers who logged into their dashboard on Fridays, correlationally, they tended to have students who made more progress through this math platform. And so their treatment in this tournament was the email message that tried specifically to get teachers to log in on Fridays, and there was some language around that. And then they had to have a control group. So they just said, oh, we'll just have a, login weekly. And they're very, very simple, plain kind of like, today is perfect for checking your PACE report, which is an aspect of this platform. That's it. Warmly, Stephanie, who is somebody that teachers knew as somebody who tended to send out emails from Zern Math, P.S. there's a raffle. So this was not supposed to do much in the tournament, and it ended up winning. And one of the things that, again, I want to emphasize is that, all of us think we have crystal balls. I mean, maybe we do, but they're very cloudy about, what's going to win in a true test of intervention efficacy. I want to say that, when you look across the data and you say, well, it wasn't the only intervention that did well. There were some sort of silver medalists, right, in this, but is there a pattern? Something that we do try to figure out across all Megastudies is is there an underlying pattern? Is there something that the better interventions have in common? And in this case, the data, spoke to us and said, the interventions that mentioned classroom specific data, personalized data, click here for your PACE report is personalized data, because when you go to the PACE report in the Zern Math dashboard as a teacher, you get data on your students, and how they are progressing through the platform, which ones of your students are stuck. So whether the email that teachers got actually had the personalized data in it or something to click to get it, those interventions did better. And we tested this with a bunch of different techniques, but, in one case, there was just, raters who, rated how, personalized or specific that data or information was in the email message, that showed a very strong positive correlation with the regression estimated impact of that condition on progress through the platform, which was the main outcome. Key findings: email nudges to teachers can boost student math achievement, particularly when they reference personalized data. The most effective email intervention nudged teachers to log in to check their students' progress and honestly didn't do anything else. No humor, no social norms. It's basically like click here to see which students are doing well. These were small effect sizes, and I think that's something I want to emphasize across our mega studies. I don't want to overstate, the size of the effect, but I do want to mention their policy relevance because they're not only cost effective. In this case, Zurn tells us that since they have to send out messages occasionally anyway, like they would estimate this to be a zero cost approach to improving math achievement. But also, for example, in this case, the small effects did endure. So after the treatment period for at least 8 weeks, when we were able to do follow-up, there was consistency in the treatment effects enduring across school socioeconomic status and as well school type. So, private, public, et cetera. I showed you a crystal ball in the beginning. I said, that was one motivation for us to do this. And I do want to give you a sense of how predictable we are finding these mega study results to be ex ante. And the answer is a little more complicated than, it's hard. It does depend. Sometimes forecasts, so meaning that separately participants are recruited, or sometimes the scientists themselves try to predict which treatment is going to win. Sometimes the forecasts show rank order correlations with actual treatment effects, meaning like, I think this is going to be the best, I think this is the second best, et cetera. Sometimes there is a not perfect, but significant and positive rank order correlation, but sometimes they don't. Sometimes scientists and expert practitioners, so for example, teachers, in the case of Zurn, sometimes they're better at forecasts, sometimes they're not. Most of the pre-registered sub-experiments yield null results, so that should give us all a big dose of humility. And one signature finding that I think is really important to emphasize is that almost always the forecasts of the scientists, of the expert practitioners, or just lay forecasters who don't really have any special knowledge, they're just wildly overly optimistic. I mean, not always, but typically, like, we think behavior change is so much easier than it really is. And these forecasts can be overly optimistic by a factor of 2x, and in some cases a factor of 30x. So we wildly overestimate how easy it is to change human behavior. I mentioned Danny Kahneman at the beginning, and it's relevant to bring him up here as we're talking about the forecast because inspired by the work by Behavior Change for Good, Danny and a team of scientists led by Linnea Gandhi. So I was on that team. So Linnea Gandhi, who is earning her doctorate, Benjamin Manning, who's also earning his doctorate, myself, and Danny, although this was completed just after Danny's passing. So he's not a co-author. We decided to write this up, and basically what we want to say in this paper is that no variable is as important as the one you're thinking about while you're thinking about it. And while reality is very complicated and messy, and whether you go to the gym or do your math work, or save for retirement, or remember to get your flu, there's so many things that are going to influence those choices. Those things interact with each other likely in complicated ways that are not always linear. But when you wake up and you think about your hypothesis and you go to bed thinking about your hypothesis, you tend not to think about anything else. And so Danny said, let's call that effect size magnification. And we are so grateful to the scientists on the team, Danny Kahneman among them, to kind of pool their intellectual resources to, with humility, continue to try to solve this very difficult problem of behavior change. I want to mention here as we're closing and going to Q&A that mega studies certainly have their limitations. Katie and I we don't want to whine, but oh my God, there's so much work. We spend a lot of time, panhandling for money. They're logistically infinitely complex. I mean, recruiting these samples is, they're massive samples and it's a massive amount of work. There are a lot of constraints when you do a mega study, things that your corporate partner, for example, won't let you do. for legal or other reasons. So there are real guardrails, and you could ask the question like, well, how much is a text message going to do? Well, we would have liked to have done more, but we were constrained in many cases by our partner. The centralized coordination is a challenge, right? There has to be a lot of work put into just getting the teams to communicate with us and with each other. The effects of the top performing interventions are almost certainly overestimated in Megastudy because of what's known as the winner's curse, right? So there's a bit of randomness and kind of like who's going to statistically end up being at the top. We, of course, correct for that statistically, but that's another limitation. And I want to emphasize here also that we don't see Megastudies as a substitute for traditional laboratory experiments or even traditional field studies. We think they are a complement. They have their limitations, but they have their strengths. And I think this is the reason why Katie and I are especially gratified to see that we're not the only ones doing them. And there are now mega studies that have looked at reducing discrimination, increasing work for environmental protection, and a whole host of, I think, societally important outcome variables. All of these mega studies are asking the question, can we as scientists come together in teams and to produce apples to apples empirical evidence that advance an important question. We're very, very grateful. I'm first of all grateful to you for listening, and as well to the team scientists, our corporate partners, and our philanthropic supporters who make this work possible. And with that, I will stop sharing, and I look forward to our conversation. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. We'll now open it up for some Q&A. If you have a question, you can do one of two things. You can put it in the chat, or you can raise your hand and we can have some live questions. Does anyone have a question for Angela? While people are thinking, I think I'll start with one. Well, I'm just really love hearing about these studies and thinking about potential uses. And sort of on the topic of big team science, I'm thinking about how maybe we can incorporate some of the types of things you've done in terms of like maybe turning the lens back on ourselves and doing some like meta science work about how big teams operate and sort of ways to nudge huge teams of collaborators to complete tasks or do things like that. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how this type of work could be applicable to sort of a meta scientific or like science of team science, improvement of workflows and processes and stuff like that.
Well, I want to say something, realistic and something positive. Just the reality is like, oh, wow, you really have to become like a world-class project manager to do so. Just like the spreadsheets and the data privacy. So there is an added cost. I think anybody who does big team science understands that, wow, the complexity increases and it's not linear. It's like, so that's the realistic thing to say. But I think as anybody who's been involved in any aspect of big team science, it's like, it's so much more fun. I mean, life is hard. It's hard, and it's so much more fun. Of course, it's more creative. It's often more productive to work as a team. But I think, if there's something I've learned at, my age is that I don't want to do things alone. I find so much more gratification in working together. And I think that's been the experience of team scientists. And Katie's now my BFF, my academic BFF, and we complete each other's sentences and bad things happen. And then we have a crisis and a funder pulls out and, we're doing it together. So I think that in addition to all the sort of like bullet pointed reasons that one might think that big team science is a good idea, mega studies and otherwise, there's the social aspect that we found particularly gratifying.
Great. Yeah, so Erin put a comment in the chat. I see she's also turned her camera on, so maybe she just wants to ask something. Yeah, Erin, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, I for selfish reasons, I'm always interested in hearing how other people organize and run these projects. Having run a couple, I've actually been writing software to do this. So I like hearing what people do without the software. So maybe I can make my software better. So purely selfish reasons, kind of how did you organize a lot of the coordination that you were discussing?
It's a great question, Erin. I think that it was a question we thought that maybe more than one person would have. And so Katie and I wrote a PNAS Nexus article. I did not show you a screenshot of that because it was not an empirical article. It was basically a how-to guide, a very practical nuts and bolts guide to how to run a mega study. Everything from pre-registration to, communicating across these scientific teams. So I would point you to that. I do think that a lot of scientific work is unglamorous. And I think sometimes when PhD students are, they ask me, they're like, oh my gosh, do I have to be Bob Cialdini to make a contribution to science? Because he's so creative. And I say he is so creative. Like, I'm no Bob Cialdini. I'm not as creative as Bob Cialdini. But I think there is a place in science for the person who's going to be like, honestly, great at getting the trains to run on time and to and then there's a place for the really creative hypothesis generator. Of course, all of us do all those things, but sometimes you can see in these big scientific teams that, well, this person is really great at, fixed effects and the, statistical analysis, and other team members are really going to be great at the wording of the text message because they have a lot of experience with that particular population. So it's a really big tent, and I think the project management is sometimes the least visible aspect of successful science, but you cannot do good scientists unless you get that working. And so that practical guide might help you, but I'll just say, we should have a Nobel Prize for project management, right? Because you couldn't have science without it.
Thanks. And Heidi posted it in the chat if other folks are interested.
Thank you, Heidi.
Yeah, my pleasure. I love a guide like that. I also share Erin's interest and passion in actually learning more about the nuts and bolts of how these things
The how-to,
are
right?
done
Yeah.
and happen.
You don't see that in the published paper usually, so we felt
yeah,
it was necessary to do that.
Yeah, as anybody who's participated or helped run any of these projects know, there's a ton that goes into it beyond the actual, scientific method that we're all used to writing up. So that's really great. The sharing of that type of knowledge is super valuable and doesn't happen enough.
One element I'll also just say that for younger scholars, but maybe all of us would find some comfort in it. Field partners back out. If you ask, remember at our very first conference, I don't remember who it was, maybe it was David Lapson, who's a economist at Harvard. I think it was him, but he will correct me if I'm wrong. If you secure a field partner, right? A hospital, a school system, a company, what are the odds that the field study will actually happen? And it's not 100% odds, right? So I think David said, maybe a third or something, that means that the majority of the time something happens, the lawyers balk, or the, company shifts their strategy, or the person that you had developed a relationship with for 3 years has left, and you are, no longer able to push your idea through because you don't have the political capital. So that happens to Katie and I too. It's not like I guess I should say that happens to Katie and me too, grammatically. But it happens to us a lot. And I think that if I had known that when I was a graduate student, I wouldn't have felt so bad. It's like, oh, you know what? It's not you, it's life, right? So that is why you have to, of course, pursue multiple partners, multiple funders. And again, I think that is why pooling the risk across science is, another aspect of big team science, right? So you all have your own Rolodex. Let's use all of them.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, we have a question in the chat from Kimberly asking you if you've done any work trying to disentangle why these interventions work, and if you have anything to say about what the mechanisms are or might be.
So, I'm careful to say that, the point of a mega study is to do an apples to apples comparison within that study. So now I'm going to try to compare across mega studies, right? Which is not an apples to apples comparison because they're different contexts. But if I squint and I look at what we have found so far, as I mentioned toward the end, reminders really do work. And sometimes it's hard to publish a paper on reminders because it's not a gee whiz counterintuitive finding. I think it's a very important finding. I think the idea that human beings forget, like how many times have you walked across the kitchen and opened the refrigerator and like, what was I looking for? I mean, if you can forget your intentions in the 3 seconds it took you to cross the kitchen to open the refrigerator door, and even they're staring at the shelves with all the cues of what you could be looking for are still blankly looking because you can't, then that suggests that reminders, and that we are finding that consistently. So if you look at, 2 text messages are better than 1 text message. 1 text message is better than 0 text messages. So that's one thing. The second thing I'll say is, Kevin Volpe, who's a physician, who's a partner on many of these teams, particularly those in the health context. He says, when people think about behavior change, as a physician, he will tell you that, like, you don't look for one-time fixes, right? So often social scientists are like, oh, so disappointing. This treatment effect, decays, 2, 4, 6 weeks afterwards. And he's like, no physician thinks that health works that way, right? Like, if you have to eat healthy, you have to keep eating healthy. If you have to take your insulin, so we shouldn't think about behavior change as one-time fixes. What if we had to remind people for the rest of their lives to get their flu shots? What if you had to remind people for the rest of their lives to go to the gym? Like, okay, we'll just remind them, just like keep reminding them. Find low cost, no cost ways of doing that. So I do think reminders are important. I also think the chronic nature of behavior change and the realistic expectation that we might have to do things more than once to get behavior to be what it should be more than once, I think is also important. In terms of very specific mechanisms, I do think that, the personalized data kind of thing, it's like, people are interested in themselves, people are interested in their classroom. I think that, the trend towards personalization seems to us like probably a very positive trend in behavior change interventions. And then, as I emphasized earlier in the talk, this idea of waiting for you, I think probably operates on multiple channels. That's my own guess. There is a expectation like, Heidi, we're waiting for you. You're like, oh, okay. Like, also a kind of the laziness. I mean, Richard Thaler, one of our team scientists and certainly a mentor to Katie and myself, would say, like, people are lazy. He calls himself like the laziest person on the planet, and he's not wrong that people are lazy. I don't know if he's the laziest person, but it's like already there. It's like already I'm defaulted into this plan, this flu shot. So I think there are some through lines, but if there is one last thing I'll just say is that when we do another mega study, it's not that we can carry over what we found in the previous mega study and predict with incredible precision what's going to happen. And if there is, again, a kind of a meta theme, it's that context really, really, really matters. Pro-social motivation may matter more or less in one context than another. Humor may work great in one context, but apparently not when you're getting a message from your doctor, right? Like, so I think that this suggests to me that our work as behavioral scientists is not going to come to an end when we figure out the universal laws, because the laws are always context specific.
Great. I will note that we've technically running up against our scheduled time limit. So if people need to run, that's totally understandable. There is one more question in the chat that I am also very curious about the answer. So we'll end with this last question. So the question is about if you run subgroup analyses to see if some of the interventions work better for like certain groups of people. The example they gave is if like the offer for a Lyft ride is effective for people without cars.
Heidi, I have an answer for you for this. And yes, finish the question.
The last question is just if the data from these studies is available for people to like sort of run these types of sub-analyses.
So we happen to think that the open science revolution is a great revolution. So everything is pre-registered. We also upload to OSF. So where partners allow, the data sets or the part of the data set that we're able to publish, we do the methods in their entirety. We have enormous supplements that are so long because they have like everything that you could possibly want to know, we hope. Also, you can email us if you can't find what you're looking for. But I want to answer this question because in the very beginning, I said, oh, we can test for moderators. Well, what did we find? You might notice that I didn't say a lot about moderators, and that is because as a rule, even though we have enormous statistical power, we are still not finding much in the way of moderation. At the beginning, we thought that we would be able to identify not only what works, but what works best for whom, under what circumstances. And in general, when something works, it's not looking like it works especially well in this subgroup and terribly in another. What does that mean? I don't know. We're not sure whether that does say that there's more consistency in what works, or whether the kind of statistical power that you need to really test moderation, and that's a whole other conversation, because of course moderators aren't always linear. So it may be a limitation of social science right now, because clearly there must be complexity. Clearly there must be an answer to the question of what works best for whom, under what circumstances. But the telescope that we have might not be powerful enough to see that far.
Okay, great. Awesome. And love to hear that you've got data up on OSF. All right. Everyone, please join me in again thanking Angela for a
Heidi, I want to
wonderful
thank
talk.
BTS. It's, I love the big team science. It's the way to go. So Katie and I are very grateful for us to just share this little window into one way of doing big team science.
Great, great. Well, we are thrilled to have you. I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you, Angela.
Awesome.